On my 18th birthday, an earthquake hit our city. It sounded like an oncoming train, before the earth lurched upwards, swaying so violently, everything not bolted down in the room went flying, including the people. About a minute later, the next shock hit in a downward movement, sending things flying again. Before I could get my bearings, the bookcase, usually attached to the wall via brackets, was jolted loose and fell on me, pinning me down. The weight of it shoved the air from my lungs, and I was winded, unable to speak. I would have survived this, however, if my parents had come to rescue me, but they didn't. Instead, my father scooped up my cousin Grace and carried her out of the building, my mother following right behind him, talking to her reassuringly. They didn't spare a single moment for me, their only child, and left me behind, unable to get out. A few minutes later an aftershock came, the whole building swaying under the force and eventually crumbling to the ground, crushing me to death. But when I opened my eyes, I was at my desk, having fallen asleep while studying. Sitting bolt upright, gasping in air denied to me in those final moments, I patted myself down and ran my hands over my face and hair, scarcely able to believe it. I picked up my phone and saw it was 1 month before my birthday. I frowned to myself and wiped sweat from my forehead, but before I could do much else, the door swung open and Grace strutted in. "Still studying?" she sneered, looking at me like I was a bug. "Only ugly people need to study, beautiful people like me can get whatever they want without effort." She flipped her hair, looking smug. The remnants of the past life dream still echoed in my head and I snapped, "Does it also mean you can't have manners?" I glared at her. "Do you often walk into other people's bedrooms without knocking?" What if I was getting changed? No manners, no class. Her face contorted and she shot back, "Who cares? You don't have anything worth seeing anyway." "Just like you don't have anything worth listening to," I said, standing up and grabbing a baseball bat, tapping it against my other hand as I advanced on her, a cold glint in my eye. I found a perverse satisfaction at the sudden fear on her face as she backed away from me. As soon as she stepped out into the hall, I set the bat into a holder on the wall by the door, acting like that was my intent the whole time. Then I looked her over with a judgmental look. "Those tissues in your bra are uneven," I told her, then slammed the door before she could reply. I clicked the lock into place and went back to my desk, staring down at the book I had been studying. It was a driver's license guide, seeing as I was going for my level 1 license in about a month. Our high school helped us get our license once we turned 16, starting with our level 3, before moving on to level 2 when we were 17, then finally level 1 at 18. My driver's education teacher was very impressed with my commitment to getting my full license, praising me and noting the dedication in my student file, which would be viewable to future employers. She didn't understand that for me my license was my lifeline, a step into independence from my biased parents, who favored my cousin more than me. Ever since my aunt and uncle had been killed in a boating accident 5 years ago, Grace had been the focus in our household, while I was shunted to the side, forgotten. It didn't hurt that Grace was the spitting image of her mother, having inherited her pale blonde hair and blue eyes from her maternal side. My mother talked often of the fact that Grace looked exactly like her and my aunt did when they were young. Both my mother and her sister had inherited their mother's blonde hair, which she got from her own mother. Blonde hair had been a fixture in the women of our family for several generations. She lamented the fact I broke the tradition, since I took after my father, inheriting his black hair rather than the traditional maternal blonde, and wished I could share more of her traits. But I was too much like my father, stubborn, ambitious, smart, and determined. Once, my father had been so proud of this, saying I would go far in life, just like he did. But years of Grace's little jabs had worn his pride away to almost nothing, so much that in my last life, he'd forgotten my birthday completely. Last year, it had been a hastily brought gift, organized by his assistant. A perfume I couldn't even wear, because I hated floral scents, so it ended up in Grace's collection. The year before it had been Grace's favorite handbag, which again ended up in her closet because I hated anything made from animal skins, and I thought a crocodile skin handbag was in poor taste. My parents had called me ungrateful, but that time, frustrated by their favoritism, I snapped that I didn't think walking around carrying something made from the flesh of an innocent animal was appropriate. I stabbed at my mother's conscience, aiming at her love of animals, stating that that crocodile hadn't done anything to deserve being carried around like luggage, and I wasn't going to disrespect it like that. I told Grace to keep it, because I didn't want to lug around a corpse, and I walked away. I hadn't seen that bag since, and my mother had become noticeably colder to me. I sat down at the desk, staring blankly at the pages of the guide, wondering why I had been given this chance. But I knew there would be no answers, and I had to live with that, and live well. The first thing I needed to do was get out of the city, but in a way that wasn't suspicious. Sitting down at my laptop, I began my escape from this toxic family, and from the inevitable quake that was just around the corner. There wasn't much I could do to save anyone else, and no one would believe me anyway. All I could do was ensure my own safety, but Grace could rot for all I cared. Fortunately, my paternal grandfather had left me a significant trust fund of several million, accessible on my 18th birthday. However, I could still invest a certain amount, with all proceeds going back into the trust. There were a few other things I could do as well, I just needed to talk to the lawyer in charge of it. I needed to secure that money, so my parents didn't give it to Grace under the guise of fairness. Because it wouldn't be fair, since my grandfather was in no way related to Grace, except through marriage. He had no relationship and therefore no obligation to my venomous cousin. But my parents wouldn't see it that way. I called the lawyer, asking to meet, saying I had concerns about the safety of my trust fund. He agreed, saying he had no appointments today and I could come in at any time. I decided to leave right away, ignoring Grace's demands of where I was going. I told her to leave me alone, she wasn't in charge of me, and I could come and go as I pleased. She stomped her foot like a toddler as I shut the apartment door in her face, almost running to the elevator just to get away from her. Garrett Hawkins was a very capable and popular lawyer, with a 96% success rate. He was once a friend of my grandfather and he'd sworn to look out for me, even against my own parents. The tall, handsome man was one of the trustees of my trust fund, and now greeted me kindly, coming out to show me into his office personally. When you told me you were concerned about your trust fund, I took a look at it, he started typing on his computer. And you were right to be concerned, there seems to be several attempts to access it using various passwords. The system doesn't have an obvious lockout, but if someone uses the wrong password 3 times in a row, it won't let them in, even if they provide the correct password. The system keeps a log of these attempts, and if it accumulates too many, it hacks into the computer's webcam and takes a photo of the perpetrator. He turned his monitor around to show me a picture of my father, looking frustrated with my mother behind him, hand on his shoulder. I should have been surprised, but I really wasn't. Slumping in my chair feeling betrayed, I stared at Mr. Hawkins. It's because of Grace. Grace? He queried. My cousin, Grace Kincaid. She came to live with us after her parents died, and they've treated her like she's a princess ever since. I think they want it for her, and they'll use the excuse that it's not fair I have a trust fund and she doesn't. Mr. Hawkins frowned. Are you being mistreated? If you are, I can convince the other trustees to make an exception, given you're almost of age. A little bit, I admitted. But more neglect than anything. They give everything to Grace, saying she's pitiful, that she lost both parents and needs more attention than me. If I complain, they say I'm being selfish and need to help out Grace more. I have a whole list if you want to read it. Email it to me, Mr. Hawkins nodded, and I pulled out my laptop, opening the file and sending it to him right then. He clicked his tongue as he read through the list, with attached audio, screenshots of messages, and even a video of the crocodile skin handbag incident. You need to get out of that household before you're kicked out with nothing. That's what will likely happen if they access your trust fund. Appreciating his honesty, I sat up straight. I need a house, not in this city, I stated firmly. I don't want to be anywhere near those people. They're not my parents anymore, they're Grace's. A nod, as Mr. Hawkins began to type on his computer again. I can arrange that, there's a lot of good properties in Old Bay, if you wanted to go there. Also, Old Bay Central University is the best university in the country, and with your grades, you'd be able to get in easily. You know my grades? I asked, bewildered, and he nodded. As one of your trustees, I am updated on your student file every month. He glanced over at me. You're a very impressive student, your grandfather would be proud. Thank you, I muttered, feeling embarrassed. I sat silently, waiting for him to finish. All right then, he said at last. I've emailed the other trustees and sent them the file for evidence. It may take a few days to go through, and I'll initiate a security lock on your trust fund. It'll make it look like the website is down for maintenance, so it doesn't look suspicious. I stood up, feeling much lighter. Thank you, Mr. Hawkins, I stood up. Anytime, Lauren, anytime. You have my number, call me if something happens, he told me. Come back on Thursday, okay? I nodded. 2 days, I just had to make it through 2 days. Grace was waiting for me when I got home, as was my mother. Where were you? My mother asked me as I walked past. I went to study somewhere more peaceful, I replied. I kept getting interrupted here. I want to do well in my studies, and I need to be able to focus. Cousin, I'm sorry, Grace said tearfully. I just wanted to make sure you didn't forget to eat. If I'm bothering you, I can move out soon, I promise. My mother scowled. Lauren, don't be so hard on Grace, she lost her parents. You need to be nicer to her. I frowned at my mother. I never said it was because of Grace. I pretended to be confused and insulted. I looked at my mother like she was terrible for thinking that. Why would you say that? My mother stammered briefly, and behind her, Grace's smirk was wiped away. I poked the bear a bit more. It was the neighbor kids, they were being very noisy. Oh, my mother said. Well, in that case, I can talk to their parents, ask them to be a bit more mindful. Don't bother, I turned away and headed to my room. I'll just study elsewhere. My mother said my name, but I pretended not to hear, stepping into my room and closing the door. I looked around the sparsely decorated room. Everything of mine that Grace had taken a liking to, had been moved to her room. My stuffed animals, clothes, jewelry, books, figurines, posters, even my plush rugs. But I had drawn the line at the painting my paternal grandmother had given me. It was a stunning piece, one that she'd painted herself, of a beautiful landscape of a vibrant green land, with a castle in the distance. It was something I'd drawn as a toddler and given to her, and she'd spent years painting it for me. I refused to part with it, pointing out that Grace already had so many of my things, and this painting was grandmother's last gift to me before she died. My parents had reluctantly agreed, and it was the only pretty thing in my room. I told Grace that if she did anything to it, I'd reveal the video I had of her making out with an older man for cash, and so far, she'd kept her distance from it. That night, I didn't join my parents and Grace for dinner, claiming I'd grabbed something to eat while on my way back from studying, and I wasn't hungry. I just quietly went to bed, praying to whatever gods had brought me back, that I could get out of here and away from my horrible family. That night, I dreamt of that day again, the sight of my parents leaving me crushed by a bookcase, while carrying out the barely injured Grace. She only had a small scratch on her head, barely bleeding, while I ended up crushed by steel, pinned under concrete and sliced by shards of glass. My blood flowed out of my body, causing my heart to beat even faster in panic, making the blood loss worse. After a while, the weakness set in, followed by a great thirst, and I began to sweat. The sound of my heart pounding in my ears drowned out everything else around me, and I thought back on the events of my life, hating my parents for abandoning me, hating Grace for stealing away my once loving mama and papa, even hating my aunt and uncle for dying and allowing Grace to ruin my life. The pounding in my head seemed to cause a headache, and tears flowed down my face. Mama. Papa, I whispered. They were my last words as I closed my eyes for the last time, sinking into silence. I came awake with a start, my body covered in sweat, my shorts and t-shirt clinging to my body, making me feel sticky and gross. I threw back the covers and slipped into the bathroom, washing away the nightmare under the spray of the shower. I stepped out, got dressed and locked my door on my way out, still not trusting Grace. I left for the library before anyone woke up, not wanting to see any of them, let alone actually talk to them. The nightmare still lingered in the back of my mind, like a malignant shadow, ruining my focus and leaving me staring at the same page for over an hour. I couldn't study like this, so I returned the book and headed to the local gym instead. Sliding into the cool water of the swimming pool and breaking into the steady rhythm of breaststroke, I felt like the malignancy of my past life was being washed away with each lap. I ended up doing several laps, feeling more and more clear-headed with each one. When I couldn't continue, I tread water and stared up at the glass dome above, the mid-morning sun blazing in a clear blue sky. Did my parents mourn me after the earthquake? Did they cry for their once-beloved little girl, or were they relieved that they could finally seize my inheritance for their pitiful adopted daughter? Likely the latter, I thought as I pulled myself out of the pool and picked up my towel. I looked around as I dried myself off. This gym actually had 3 different swimming pools, one each for men and women, then a third for both. They built the extra pools after many complaints of men leering at women in bathing suits caused a stir. There were only 3 others in the room, one of which was a female lifeguard, looking official in her red shorts and yellow polo. Dry, I gathered my things from the free lockers and sat to check my phone. I had several messages from Grace, asking where I was, who I was with, and when I would be back. I scowled. Who did she think she was? My parents would say that she's just concerned for me, but I knew she was just being nosy, not wanting me to enjoy anything. I wasn't allowed to be happy, according to her logic. I just put my phone away and went to have a shower and get dressed. My stomach rumbled, reminding me that I'd skipped breakfast, which was not unusual for me. If I ate too soon after waking up in the morning, I got nauseous. I went to a cafe and ordered my favorite honey cake with a mocha, relaxing in the sun, allowing it to dry my damp hair. Taking in a mouthful of the cake, I hummed in appreciation. This cafe was the only place to make it, and it was very popular. I was lucky to get a piece. It was actually several layers of honey-flavored cakes, made with burnt honey, butter, sugar, flour, cinnamon, eggs and salt, baked into several flat discs, stacked on top of each other, with a filling made from more burnt honey, dulce de leche, and cream. It was so delicious I wished I could have it every day. But such things were not good for one's physical health, only the spiritual. I double-checked my account, noting my allowance from the trust fund had been paid last night, and thought about buying myself some new clothes, just anything to kill time before going back to that house. Because although my father was well off, the truth was he had lost a significant amount of his own inheritance on failed investments and frivolous purchases, mostly for my mother and Grace, while my inheritance remained untouched, accumulating vast amounts of interest. I decided to take my time, leisurely strolling around the shops and buying some nice jeans, shirts, socks, some pajamas, and undergarments. I chose jeans and shirts because Grace preferred dresses, likely to sell her pitiful little victim look, I thought darkly. I actually wanted to spit at the thought as I rode the elevator up to our floor that evening. When I stepped into the apartment, Grace rushed over, looking all concerned. "Cousin, where were you?" she asked in a panicked voice. "I was worried when you didn't respond to my messages. I thought something had happened to you." Like mother and father, she began to weep. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. My father scowled at my bags. "Lauren, your cousin was here worried sick about you, and you dare to spend money on frivolous things," he demanded. "How could you be so rude to Grace?" Ignoring Grace's provocative look, I frowned at my father. "Their clothes. Since you gave so many of my things to Grace, I've hardly had anything to wear, so I used my allowance to buy some basic clothing." I paused. "Am I not allowed to buy some simple clothes?" My father's scowl deepened. "Why didn't you respond to Grace's messages? Why didn't you reply to ease her mind? You know what she's been through." I pulled out my phone and pretended to check it. My phone was on silent again. "It's getting old, so it does that a lot now." "I'm sorry, cousin," I said, curling my nose at Grace where my father couldn't see, just to let her know I wasn't sorry at all. "Anyway, I was walking around a lot today, so I'm going to go straight to bed." Without bidding them goodnight, I left for my room, ignoring Grace's attempts to peer into my bags. My father opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but I ignored him, like I had my mother last night. Finally safe in my room, I carefully placed my new clothes into my suitcase instead of my drawers. I had full confidence in my lawyer's ability to convince the board I should be emancipated, given my student file often referring to me as a dedicated and mature student, as well as the fact my purchases were usually restricted to necessities or cake from that cafe I liked. Lying in bed, listening to the distant murmurs of the city, I unexpectedly felt tears spring to my eyes. Once upon a time, my parents absolutely adored me, showering me with love and affection, buying me all kinds of things, and taking me on holidays to incredible places. Memories of my mother's kisses and father's hugs combined with movie nights at home and baking on weekends caused a longing in my chest so strong, I couldn't help but sob. Why? Why was I suddenly a black sheep to my parents? I rolled over and stared at the wall, reliving those happy memories over and over, remembering the love and the warmth, before Grace swooped in and stole all of it for herself. Tears flowed, soaking into my pillow as I lay in the dark, praying to the gods again for a good outcome tomorrow. Unfortunately for me, I slept in, waking up long after my parents had gone to work. Grace was already awake and playing on her phone when I stepped out, ready to leave for anywhere else but here. I locked my door behind me, and she scowled at me. Why do you keep your door locked all the time? What are you hiding in there? A boy? Cash? Grandmother's jewels? I knew she was only being half sarcastic. My grandmother's jewels were legendary and Grace would do anything to get them, but they were safe, in a safety deposit box in the same trust as my grandfather's money. Even if I did have my grandmother's jewels in there, I wouldn't give them to you, I snapped. They're mine by right. If you want family jewelry, go ask your father's mother. The woman was alive as far as I knew, just didn't like Grace. Apparently she could see through the facade and thought Grace was a waste of her name. I'd just ask your parents, she smirked. Then I'd have all of them, even the heart of the mountain. She looked positively gleeful at the idea of the sacred piece, given to ladies of a certain standing or class for unclear reasons. It was part of a 5-part set, which included the ruby heart of the volcano, emerald heart of the earth, sapphire heart of the ocean and the amethyst heart of the soul. You wouldn't be able to wear it even if you did get your greedy little hands on it. It wasn't awarded to you, I reminded her. She shrugged. So? I could wear it around friends. What friends? I muttered to myself as I opened the door, annoyed to see the out-of-order light illuminated on the elevator. I headed for the stairs, ignoring Grace's reply. I had only taken 3 steps down when I felt a sharp shove from behind and I fell down the stairs. Fortunately, the stairs weren't very long, but I still ended up in hospital with a mild concussion and some severe bruising. I called my mother, but instead of reassuring me, she scolded me instead. Lauren, what did you say to Grace? She demanded. She's hysterical, and I had to leave work to go comfort her. I didn't say anything other than she can't wear grandmother's heart of the mountain pendant, I said annoyed. Mother, I need help. I'm in Southern Ridge's hospital. Grace pushed me down the stairs. You shouldn't have provoked her, you know how sensitive she is, my mother snapped. Grace is fragile after the loss of her parents. She floated on that life raft for 2 days, before anyone found her. You should be nicer to her, she's traumatized. The same old words again, and I snapped back, Grace, Grace, Grace. Seems to be all you care about nowadays. I began to cry, out of sheer frustration. Just because she had a bad time, doesn't mean she can hurt others, even me. Haven't I given enough? Does she want my life too? Some mother you are. My mother started to say something but I hung up, immediately calling Garrett Hawkins. Lauren, I was waiting for your call, he started but I interrupted him, still sobbing. Mr. Hawkins, Grace pushed me down the stairs. I'm in the hospital now, and my mother doesn't even care. Please, can you come? I was blubbering and incoherent, but Mr. Hawkins was kind and patient. I'm on my way. Which hospital and room? I told him and he instructed me to inform the nurses that he was coming. I did so, and waited, sipping the warm honey water the nurse had given me after I told her I hadn't eaten anything. Mr. Hawkins had his laptop with him and he set it up on a small table the nurse offered him. He thanked her and she actually blushed as she left, closing the door behind her. "Right, tell me everything," he said sharply, and he took notes as he listened. He asked how old Grace was and I told him she was 18, which was considered old enough for jail. When he mentioned jail, I panicked, not wanting her to be arrested. "I just want to get out of here," I pleaded. "Well, I have good news," he replied. "I have petitioned the YPC, that's the Youth Protection Court, to have you emancipated based on the evidence of neglect and favoritism at your parents' hands. The fact they have taken many of your belongings and given them to Grace against your will, instead of buying Grace her own things, despite having the funds, also works in our favor. Because Grace is an orphan, your parents receive a weekly benefit to help with the costs of raising her, so they should have more than enough. They receive $1,000 a week from your uncle's life insurance. It continues until she turns 21, after which she will receive the rest in a lump sum. They give half of it to Grace as an allowance," I told him, sipping more honey water. "That's $500 a week," he sounded shocked. "What is she spending all that money on?" "Clothes, bags, shoes, imported snacks, trips to the theme park and cinema," I shrugged. "I'm used to it now. They give her more if she asks." Mr. Hawkins shook his head in disbelief and looked back at his laptop. "The other trustees and I have agreed to allow you access to your trust fund and all associated assets." "Associated assets?" I asked. "Yes, the trust fund wasn't the only thing your grandparents left you. Your grandmother had a house in Old Bay, if you wanted to go there." I nodded in agreement and he said he would come pick me up later this afternoon, since the nurses wanted to monitor me for a few more hours. The whole time, my phone was buzzing with messages and calls from my parents and Grace, but I ignored them all. This time next week, I would hopefully be in Old Bay with a new number, while my parents and their beloved other daughter would be stuck here, with the earthquake. It was getting dark by the time Mr. Hawkins and I finally arrived at the apartment. The nurses had told him I needed to have something to eat and so he'd taken me to a local fast food place, and we'd ended up talking for a lot longer than we realized. He told me stories about my grandfather that made me laugh and miss the old man so much more. If he was still around, Grace would have never gotten away with even a quarter of what she pulled with my parents. I missed him very much right now. I could have used his advice and strong voice. Mr. Hawkins also told me why he wasn't my father's lawyer, like he was for me and my grandfather. Apparently, one of my father's friends from school trained to become a lawyer, and my father supported him by using him instead of Garrett Hawkins. It was a good thing to do, Mr. Hawkins admitted, and I found myself staring at my empty tray, lost in thought. I wondered why he had changed so much from that good man he used to be, and Mr. Hawkins patted my arm. I hadn't realized I'd wondered that out loud until he replied to me. "Duty changes people," he told me. "In Grace, he sees you and wants to help her. He is doing for Grace what he hopes others would do for you if you were in that situation." But I shook my head, looking out at the darkening sky. I wouldn't want that. We got up to leave and I took a deep breath of the cool night air before I got into Mr. Hawkins' sleek silver electric car. I felt both nervous and determined as I rode the elevator up. Mr. Hawkins had organized 2 bodyguards to accompany me, in case things got out of hand. They introduced themselves as Helena and Rodrigo, a married couple, both tall, fit and muscular. Their presence made me feel much more confident. I opened the door and walked into the sight of my parents at the table, urging Grace to have some more chicken. When they saw me they both got up, looking outraged, but became confused when Mr. Hawkins, Helena, and Rodrigo walked in. "Lauren, who are these people?" my mother asked me. "Hello Mrs. Saccomanno, my name is Garrett Hawkins, I'm Miss Saccomanno's lawyer." He handed over his business card. "Lawyer?" my father questioned. "Why are you here?" "I'm moving out," I said defiantly. "You've coddled Grace to the point of neglect of me, and I can't stand it anymore." I turned to the bodyguards. "My room is the last on the left, my suitcase is under the bed, Also, please grab the painting off the wall and the small gold box in the bedside table. I handed my key over to Helena, who nodded, leading Rodrigo down the hall to my room. They came out a moment later with my things. Hold on a moment, my father said, stepping forward. You're a minor, you can't leave home. Actually, Mr. Hawkins stepped in front of me, she can. We have evidence of favoritism and neglect. You have not only taken things from your daughter for your niece, you have emotionally neglected her to the point of near depression. The YPC has found sufficient evidence of this and agreed to an emancipation. Also, with today's incident, it is clear that she is not safe here. He looked pointedly at Grace, who squirmed in her seat. You're just lucky my client doesn't want to press charges, because I could have you in prison for assault and maybe even attempted murder. Don't be ridiculous, my father sputtered, but Mr. Hawkins was firm. I could in fact convince a jury that your niece wanted everything of Lauren's for herself and tried to kill her by pushing her down the stairs. It's already documented that she has almost everything of Lauren's already. It's not a big leap. But, we love Lauren just as much as Grace, my mother said desperately, and I scoffed. My mother looked at me, tears pooling in her big blue eyes. Why do you want to leave us? We're your parents. We love you. Even though I was annoyed by the attempted guilt trip, I kept my face blank as I stared into her watery blue eyes. Why would I not? Look at our rooms, mother, at all the beautiful things Grace has. Things taken from me, as a matter of fact. You even gave her my limited edition fairy tattletale duvet, and you know how much I loved that. Look at your accounts, check your financials, and see for yourself how much money you have spent on Grace, even without the weekly insurance payout. If I didn't get an allowance from my trust fund, I'd have nothing. Like today, Grace pushed me down the stairs, literally tried to fucking murder me, and you still blamed me. I lifted my sleeves, revealing the angry purple bruises on my arms, pointing at them. See what your precious niece did to me today? And yet you're still defending her. You didn't even come to see me. What if I had broken bones or needed surgery? You weren't there. You didn't care, and I know now that getting away from you is the best thing for me. My mother stood there trembling. Baby, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Please stay with us. Sorry doesn't cut it, I said coldly, waving a dismissive hand. Besides, I can't trust you anymore. You think we're not aware of your attempts to access the trust fund grandfather Alejandro left for me? My mother stumbled forward. We needed that so we could invest in the ARC project. You saw how promising that is. We could have quadrupled our investment. I don't care about your reasons. I turned away. Let's go. Lauren, wait, my father called behind me as my mother slumped to the floor crying. But I didn't wait, I couldn't wait. Freedom awaited me, and I was going to grab it. Behind me, I heard Mr. Hawkins say in a cool, professional tone, I have a folder here that explains everything. He tossed the manila folder onto the table. Good night, Mr. Leonardo, Mrs. Susanna. He joined us in the elevator. My last glimpse of my parents was of my mother on the floor, sobbing, and my father staring at me, pale-faced and trembling. Behind them, Grace looked triumphant, for now. My parents tried constantly to contact me, but I refused their calls, finally sending them both a message to leave me alone, stating they could focus on their beloved Grace from now on, like they had done since she arrived. I changed my number the day I moved into my grandmother's old Bay City house, a beautiful traditional manor in the nicest part of the city, maintained by a gardener, 2 maids, and a butler. I hired a chef to cook for me and a driver to take me to school. I had accepted a place at Old Bay Central University and was completing my last few high school exams there, due to my special circumstances. 2 days before my birthday, I asked Mr. Hawkins to fly out and visit me, which he did. Ostensibly, it was to discuss my options for my grandmother's Heart of the Mountain pendant, since I couldn't wear it myself. But the reality was, I didn't want him in the city when the earthquake hit. I woke up late on my birthday and switched on the TV, flooded with video feeds about the earthquake in South City. They were saying something about a fault line, that's why it was so severe. However, seismologists had long been aware of this potential fault line and put forth a bill that meant all buildings had to be earthquake safe. Obviously, my parents' building was not, as the feed cut to that very building, people wondering why it had collapsed. In the background, I saw my parents and Grace, mostly unharmed, although Grace had a cut on her forehead and was crying. I turned off the TV, not really interested anymore. I had lessons to prepare for and a closet to fill. Maybe one day, I would forgive my parents. After all, I knew they were truly sorry and I still loved them, despite everything. But for now, I just needed time.
Extra. Susanna. When my sister died, I was devastated. Although I had married a wealthy man, and her husband was just an insurance actuary, we never lost touch. She was my baby sister and I adored her, taking her for lunches and shopping sprees on the regular. My brother-in-law was a kind, thoughtful man who treated his wife, and later their daughter, like royalty. But then she was taken from me. In a twist of cruel fate, my poor sweet baby sister was gone, swallowed up by the rage of the ocean along with her husband, leaving behind their only child, Grace. When Grace came to live with us, I wanted to give her the best of everything. For when I looked into her face, I saw my sweet Isla, and I could pretend, briefly, that she was still here with me. Unfortunately, we weren't as financially well off as we used to be, my husband pouring all our extra funds into rescuing the company, so I gave her things from my daughter Lauren, thinking she wouldn't mind. Lauren was a mature, quiet girl, much like her father, and while I was a little disappointed she hadn't turned out more like me, I was proud of her commitment to her studies and her agreement to share her things with Grace. However, she threw a fit as soon as Grace mentioned liking the painting given to Lauren by my mother-in-law. She said she was putting her foot down on that, since it was her grandmother's last gift to her, and it meant more to her than anything else she owned. I understood that and agreed to her demand of keeping it. After all, Grace was the last remnant of my only sister, how could I not understand Lauren's pain? But I didn't understand Lauren's pain at all, not until it was far too late to fix it. That night, when she stood there and told us she was leaving, I felt something inside me shatter like glass. I couldn't help the tears that flowed as I asked her why. Her cold response shook me to my core, her face devoid of all emotion as she told me to look in her room and compare it to Grace's. She told me to look at our finances and calculate how much money they had spent on Grace compared to her. She reminded me that when Grace had pushed her down the stairs, I had blamed Lauren for inciting Grace. And when I didn't even come to see her at the hospital, it had solidified her decision to cut us all off. I apologized and begged her to stay, but she brushed me off, telling me she didn't trust me anymore after she found out me and her father had attempted to steal her inheritance. I tried to explain that we needed it for the ARK investment, that it was sure to make dividends, but she just walked out with her lawyer. I stood there, sinking to the floor, realizing I had lost my only child, my baby girl. I sobbed as she walked out of my life, leaving me feeling worse than the night Isla was taken from me. The folder left behind by her lawyer told us everything, outlining our wrongs in crisp black and white, making us realize how much we'd pushed Lauren into the background, all for Grace. My husband and I tried many times to contact her, to bring her back, but she blocked us everywhere, telling us to focus on our beloved adopted daughter, Grace, just like we had for the last 5 years. I felt torn up inside, like I was filled with sharp knives, stabbing at me with each movement. Losing my own child, I thought, it was worse than dying. As for Grace, I couldn't look at her anymore without being reminded of all the things we'd done to Lauren on behalf of Grace. To me, Grace was no longer a reminder of Isla, but of the loss of Lauren, and I couldn't stand it. I told my husband I couldn't bear having Grace around anymore, and he agreed, vowing to find her her own apartment and have her move out as soon as possible. But Grace threw a fit, screaming that she was our daughter now and we had to look after her and love her unconditionally. She yelled to my face we were better off without sad little Lauren, and she would be a better daughter than that bitch anyway. At that moment, all the pain I felt turned to rage, and I slapped Grace so hard across the face she fell to the floor, her lip bleeding and tears in her eyes. "You are not our daughter," I told her firmly. "You will move out in a week, into a place we purchase for you, or we will throw you out and leave you with nothing." I then left her there to cry, unable to bear the sight of her anymore. In my mind, I had finally separated Isla from Grace. That night I had a dream where Lauren never moved out and remained with us. Then, on her birthday, the earthquake happened, and Grace was injured, bleeding from the head and crying profusely, begging us to help her. All I could see was Isla, hurt and crying, and I rushed to her side as my husband carried her out. We were only outside a few minutes when a second earthquake hit, causing the building we lived in for so long to collapse. When a neighbor asked me about Lauren, I went looking for her in the crowd but never found her. It was the emergency excavation and rescue team that found her body, broken and bloodless, crushed by the building when it collapsed. The sight of her mangled body had me falling to my knees and screaming, begging her to wake up, but she never did. I gripped her hand and bawled my eyes out, while my husband knelt next to me and cried just as hard. "Why didn't she get out?" I asked the EER team, and their answer horrified me. "We believe the first earthquake dislodged a bookcase and she was pinned under it when the second one hit. She couldn't get out in time." "I'm so sorry, ma'am." So if I had just remembered to look for Lauren instead of fussing over Grace's superficial injury, Lauren would have lived. Grace only needed a band-aid, while Lauren had suffered being crushed. Then I realized the only bookcase in the apartment that could have pinned Lauren was in the living room, where everyone had been. We walked right by her and didn't even bother to look. When I woke up, I cried into my husband's arms, telling him the story and wondering if there was any truth to it. My husband reassured me, saying it was just a nightmare born of my guilt towards Lauren. I tried to feel reassured, but as I made breakfast that morning, I couldn't help but feel a sense of terrible dread. So I wasn't completely surprised when the massive earthquake hit, sending me flying into the wall and my husband back down the hall. It was like a giant had picked up our building. Then it came back down and I saw the bookcase fall over, right where Lauren had been in my dream. It was quiet now except for distant screams and Grace crying for help. I got to my feet as my husband came running over to me asking if I was all right. Grace, who had been on her phone while sitting on the couch, cried out to us to help her, but my husband snapped. "It's just a cut, stop being a baby and get up, there could be an aftershock." He looked at me, his eyes reflecting the same pain and horror I felt. I rushed for the stairs, with my husband right behind me, Grace following sulkily, whining about her cut. Just like last time, an aftershock collapsed our building. Later, we learned it was because of shoddy construction and inferior materials. I tried calling Lauren, but the mechanical voice on the other end told me the number was no longer in service. I felt so empty inside. Did Lauren not care about us? Wouldn't she want to know if we survived? I waited for her to call, but she never did. Meanwhile, the homeowners filed a class action lawsuit against the construction company for the poor construction work that not only resulted in the loss of our home, but killed 7 people and crippled many others. They tried to argue that we couldn't sue for a natural disaster, until the lawyer pointed out the building was listed as earthquake safe. If proper construction and materials had been used, the building would have survived, just like the others around it did. We ended up winning the suit and receiving several million that we immediately injected into the promising ARC project, while moving to Old Bay City, in hopes of finding Lauren. We found out there were no available houses in the gated community she lived in, so we tried to visit her, only to find out we were blacklisted. We were devastated, wondering if there was any way to fix things. We had only been in our new house for 2 weeks, when we received a summons from a lawyer by the name of Garrett Hawkins. My husband was worried, pointing out Hawkins was Lauren's lawyer. We went anyway, hoping against hope to see Lauren there. What awaited me in the lawyer's office was a shock so great, I almost felt my heart stop. There she was, my sweet baby sister, Isla, talking to my precious little girl. "Lauren," I croaked out, "Isla." Both women turned to look at me, one with love and the other with indifference. Before I could say anything more, Grace stepped in behind me and gasped, "Mother?" Isla's gaze moved from me to her daughter, and the love twisted into a hateful snarl. "You little bitch," she spat out. "You did this, tampered with our boat, took the life raft, marooned me on a desert island, killed your father, my poor husband. I'm going to kill you." She stormed towards us, but the police in the room stopped her, then turned to Grace. "Grace Kincaid, you're under arrest for tampering with a ship, causing death, marooning and injury. You have the right to free speech or silence. You have the right to an attorney, self or court-appointed. You have the right to a phone call to organize your defense, and you may waive any of these rights should you so choose. Do you understand these rights as explained to you?" "What?" Grace panicked as they led her away. "No, I didn't do anything." I ignored Grace as I traced the lines of my sister's face with my eyes, drinking in the sight of her. "Isla," I sobbed. "What happened? Where is brother?" My sister sat us down and told us everything. While out on the water, something in the engine had malfunctioned, causing a small explosion soon after. She told me Drew had been injured in the blast, the ship sinking quickly. Despite the life raft being missing in the storm that arose, they had managed to get to an island by floating on a broken door, with a few salvaged supplies, including, to their surprise, the waterproof security box, which contained the footage needed to prove Grace's guilt. Unfortunately, Drew had succumbed to his injuries soon after, forcing Isla to bury him there. This island was far out of the way of any normal boat or plane routes, and the waters around were not very good for fishing. For 5 years Isla survived on fruits and nuts growing on the island before being rescued by a fishing trawler that was knocked off course by a storm. I hugged her close, despairing at how thin she was, insisting she come stay with us. Isla looked over at Lauren, then agreed, thanking me profusely. None of us could quite believe that Grace had sabotaged the ship's engine and jumped ship, leaving both her loving parents to die at sea. Grace's trial was just a couple of weeks later, and she was found guilty, thanks to the security box footage. She was sentenced to life in prison, with a chance for voluntary death in 30 years. She cried, apologizing, saying she was just so envious of Lauren's fancy and luxurious life, while her parents were barely middle class. Her excuse made her look shallow and greedy, and the jury showed her no sympathy. After the trial, I approached Lauren outside the courthouse, asking her if there was any way to repair our relationship. Lauren was hesitant before agreeing to meet up with us once a month, to hopefully repair the damage. It wasn't much, but I would take it. I would take it.
I methodically removed all traces of Theodora Hartville from the residence. My parents and Gordon hadn't realized I'd removed all traces of me from their phones too, my number, any messages or photos, gone. Picking up my suitcase, I looked around the house I'd grown up in for the last time, before stepping out into a new life.